A quiet home, a playful child, a trusted family pet, then shattering screams, a mother's voice breaking in terror, neighbors rushing toward the sound of chaos. What could turn a place of love into a scene of horror? And how did a family's own companion become their greatest danger? February 2022. In a quiet neighborhood of Milton Keynes, England, the Adeniran family's home was filled with the sounds of everyday life. 4-year-old Ayomikun, known lovingly as Mikie, was the center of his mother's world. A bright, playful little boy with a laugh that filled the house. To the outside world, their home looked like any other. Safe, ordinary, secure. But inside, something was waiting that would turn their lives upside down in an instant. The Adenirans had a pet. An American bulldog. Strong, powerful, trusted. To them, it wasn't a threat. It was family. The kind of animal they believed would grow up alongside Mikie, protecting him, giving him love. No one imagined this bond of trust would become a weapon of destruction. That day, nothing felt unusual. Mikie played, his mother moved about the house, and the family dog lingered nearby. The atmosphere was calm, the routine unbroken. But in homes where tragedy strikes, it often begins with normalcy, a sense of safety that blindsides its victims. No one in Milton Keynes could have predicted that this ordinary day was about to end in screams, blood, and a mother's worst nightmare. Ayomikun Mikie Adeniran was only 4 years old, a boy just beginning to discover the world. He loved simple joys, toy cars, running across the living room floor, chasing after his mother's embrace. To his family, he wasn't just a child, he was light itself. Neighbors would often see him outside, his little frame dwarfed by the family's bulldog. To them, it looked sweet, a boy and his dog, growing together like best friends. No one saw danger. No one thought that the animal's immense size and raw power could one day turn against him. For Mikie, the dog wasn't a predator. It was a companion. In his young mind, animals were meant to love, not harm. He had no concept of fear, no reason to suspect that the same creature napping quietly one moment could, in the next, unleash instincts as old as time. His mother adored him, her little man. Every day was centered around keeping him safe, nurturing his innocence. But some threats are invisible until it's too late. The world saw Mikie as just a child. But in the story that was about to unfold, he became the smallest and most vulnerable piece in a tragedy no one could stop. The Adeniran family's American bulldog wasn't just a pet. It was part of their home. Heavy, muscular, and towering compared to little Mikie, the dog carried itself with the power of an animal bred for strength. But to the family, it was more than that. They trusted it. They believed it was safe. Friends and neighbors had seen the dog before. Large, imposing, but never violent. It was the sort of animal people noticed instantly, a presence that filled the yard. Yet inside the house, it was treated as a companion, living alongside the child it would one day destroy. No growls, no warning signs that anyone could recall. That's what made the tragedy so unbearable. Families place their faith in the animals they raise, convincing themselves that years of familiarity erase instincts written into muscle and bone. An American bulldog is powerful, its jaws capable of crushing through bone, its weight enough to pin an adult to the ground. In the wrong moment, when instinct overrides domestication, such power is uncontrollable. On that day in 2022, the illusion of safety shattered. The dog wasn't a pet. It wasn't a friend. It was a predator, one that the family had invited into their lives. It was just an ordinary afternoon in the Adeniran home. Mikie played inside, the sound of a 4-year-old's laughter carrying through the house. His mother moved about the home, not sensing the storm about to break within her walls. The dog was there, as always, a hulking shadow in the background. For years, it had been trusted near Mikie, a fixture of daily life. But that trust was about to be shattered in an instant. Experts say it can happen without warning. A snap, a shift in body language, and then instinct takes over. 1 second calm, the next, violence. The bulldog's eyes locked on the child. Its posture stiffened, muscles tightening like coiled rope. Then it lunged. The sound tore through the house, the sudden crash of movement, the horrifying scream of a child. Mikie was on the ground, and the dog's jaws were already clamped down. There was no time to think, no time to prepare. The ordinary day had transformed into a nightmare, a predator awakening in the middle of a family home. The moment Mikie screamed, his mother came running. What she saw froze her blood, her little boy trapped beneath the family dog, the animal's jaws locked tight around him. She threw herself at the bulldog, pounding, pulling, screaming for it to let go. But it was like fighting stone and steel. The dog shook Mikie violently, its size and power overwhelming every frantic effort to break its grip. Neighbors rushed in, drawn by the sounds of terror. Bare hands grabbed at the animal, others tried to strike it, anything to free the child. The small house became chaos. Shouts, sobs, and the guttural growl of a dog that would not relent. Every second felt like a lifetime. Mikie's mother screamed his name, her voice breaking as she tried to wrench her son free. Blood smeared across the floor, proof of the damage already done. In that moment, the room wasn't just a home anymore. It was a battlefield. One where love and desperation clashed against raw, unrestrained animal power. But despite their strength, despite their courage, the dog would not let go. By the time emergency crews reached the home, the scene was already a nightmare. Neighbors stood outside in shock, their faces pale, their voices trembling as they pointed rescuers inside. Paramedics rushed through the doorway and froze for a heartbeat at what they saw. A small child motionless on the floor, a mother hysterical, and blood staining the walls and carpet. The family dog had finally been restrained, but the damage was already catastrophic. They worked with desperate urgency, compressing wounds, forcing air, searching for a pulse that slipped further away with every passing second. The playroom had become an emergency room, filled with commands barked out over the sound of sirens wailing outside. But deep down, everyone knew the truth. The injuries were too severe. The time had passed too quickly. What they were witnessing wasn't a fight for life anymore. It was the final, heartbreaking moments of a little boy who had no chance. When the paramedics finally stopped, silence crashed down like a hammer. A silence broken only by the cries of a mother whose world had just been torn apart. Mikie was gone. As the reality set in that Mikie was gone, authorities turned their attention to the animal that had caused it. The once beloved family dog, an American bulldog they had trusted like a protector, was now snarling, pacing, and drenched in the blood of the child it had killed. Armed officers entered the yard cautiously. Neighbors pressed against fences, watching with horror as the pet that had once played in the grass was treated like a loaded weapon. The mother screamed, begging through tears, unable to process that the animal she had raised was now being taken away like a criminal. Animal control officers moved in with catch poles and cages. The dog resisted, lunging and snapping, its power reminding everyone why Mikie had stood no chance. It took several men to finally subdue the beast and drag it out of the home. The sight of the dog being hauled away was unbearable. A final, cruel punctuation to a nightmarish scene. The family had lost their son, and in the same breath, the pet they once called their own. One life ended, another condemned, and a family left broken in between. News of Mikie's death spread faster than anyone could comprehend. Within hours, the quiet street where the tragedy happened was swarming with reporters, flashing cameras, and stunned neighbors. People whispered in disbelief. How could this happen here? To them, to him. Children clutched their parents tighter as they walked by, suddenly fearful of every barking dog behind a fence. Friends of the family broke down in tears, laying flowers and teddy bears at the gate, the same gate Mikie had once skipped through on his way to play. The local school sent grief counselors. Teachers struggled to explain to classmates why their friend wouldn't be coming back. One parent described the mood as, like the whole town lost a child. Online, the story exploded. Headlines screamed of a family dog turned killer. Anger, sorrow, and fear collided in comment sections. Some demanded bans on dangerous breeds. Others defended the animal, calling it a tragic accident. But beneath all the noise was the image no one could shake. A little boy, full of life one day, gone the next, in the most brutal way imaginable. The community wasn't just shocked. It was shaken to its core. Police sealed off the home, sirens flashing against the stunned faces of neighbors. Forensic vans arrived, and officers moved in quietly, carrying evidence bags. Inside, they found the dog, still pacing, agitated, its muzzle stained. It was seized immediately and taken away, a once trusted family pet now treated as evidence in a fatal crime. Detectives began piecing together the timeline. There had been no prior reports of aggression, no warning signs recorded. The American Bulldog had lived as a household companion, until, without explanation, it turned lethal. Authorities scoured the house, spoke with frantic neighbors who had rushed to help, and questioned family members through tears. The coroner's office later confirmed what no one wanted to hear. Mikie's injuries were catastrophic. No medical intervention could have saved him. As the investigation unfolded, officials announced the dog would be euthanized. That decision sparked fierce debate, some calling it justice, others wondering if the tragedy was rooted in the very nature of powerful breeds. But one fact was undeniable. In a matter of seconds, a home filled with love and laughter had become a crime scene. And the cause of death was not a stranger, not an intruder, but the family's own pet. The tragedy ignited a firestorm. On talk shows, in Parliament, and across social media, one question thundered louder than the rest. Are certain breeds too dangerous to be kept as pets? The American Bulldog is powerful, muscular, bred for strength. Advocates say with proper training and care, they can be gentle companions. But after Mikie's death, those arguments rang hollow for a grieving community. For families, the thought was chilling. A child could grow up alongside a dog, share meals and laughter, and still be one unguarded moment away from disaster. Experts lined up to weigh in. Veterinarians warned about genetic predispositions toward aggression in large, strong breeds. Behaviorists argued it was about upbringing, environment, and human responsibility, not the animal itself. But as the debate raged, Mikie's face, a 4-year-old boy lost too soon, became the tragic symbol. His death forced parents everywhere to glance nervously at their own pets, to wonder, could it happen here? Could it happen to us? In homes across the UK, whispers grew louder, questions more urgent. Trust in man's best friend had been shaken, and once again society found itself asking, how much risk are we willing to accept inside our own homes? The neighborhood where Mikie once played fell into silence. His toys still sat in the yard. His laughter, once so familiar, was now only an echo. For neighbors, it was unthinkable. That tragedy had struck so close to home, behind the fence of an ordinary family house. Candlelit vigils appeared on the street. Flowers and stuffed animals piled up against the gate. Strangers wept alongside family, united by grief for a boy they had never met, but whose story pierced their hearts. Parents clutched their own children tighter that night, staring uneasily at the dogs they once trusted. Questions lingered in every whispered conversation. Could it have been prevented? Who is to blame? But in the midst of sorrow, something else surfaced. Guilt. For Mandy, Mikie's mother, the pain was unbearable. She had fought with everything she had, screaming, pulling, trying to save her son. And yet, it wasn't enough. Those who loved her reassured her it was no one's fault. But in her silence, in her empty arms, she carried a burden no parent should ever have to bear. A whole community mourned, but none more deeply than the woman who had heard her child's final cries. Mikie's death was not just a family's tragedy, it was a wake-up call. For years, people have said, it's just a dog, he's never hurt anyone. But beneath the wagging tail and loyal eyes lies an instinct millions of years old. In an instant, trust can shatter, and the animal you thought you knew can turn into something unrecognizable. Experts point to warning signs, powerful breeds, unpredictable behavior, the risks of leaving a child vulnerable. Yet these warnings are often drowned out by love, by routine, by the belief that it could never happen here. But it did, and Mikie's story forces us to confront a brutal truth. Even in the heart of our homes, danger can live among us. Parents across the nation looked at their pets differently after that day. Safety campaigns began. Tougher laws were debated. But for Mikie's family, no law, no lesson could bring him back. The tragedy endures as a stark reminder. Love does not erase instinct, and trust does not always guarantee safety. A child's life was the price of forgetting that, and the echoes of his final day still hang heavy, a warning carved in grief. Mikie's story is one of the most heartbreaking we've ever told, a reminder of how quickly trust can turn into tragedy. His life was short, but his memory leaves a warning none of us can ignore. If this story moved you, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next case we uncover. Because what's coming next is another story of an ordinary day that turned into unthinkable horror, and trust me, you'll want to see it. 4-year-old Ayomikun, Mikie, Adeniran, was killed by his own family's pet bulldog. A chilling reminder that even trusted pets can turn deadly. The same grim truth emerged in 2001 when Diane Whipple lost her life to 2 Presa Canario dogs kept as pets by her neighbors. Here's her story. The hallway of a quiet San Francisco apartment building is shattered by screams. A neighbor opens their door and freezes. Just feet away, a woman is crumpled against the wall, her face and neck covered in blood. 2 massive dogs are still lunging, teeth snapping, their bodies blocking any escape. Someone shouts for help. Another dials 911 with trembling hands. Every second counts, but no one can get close without being attacked themselves. It's chaos, terror, and disbelief all at once. In those final desperate moments, no one yet knows they are witnessing one of the most shocking and preventable tragedies the city has ever seen. Before that day in January 2001, Diane Whipple's life was about movement, discipline, and passion. At 33, she was head women's lacrosse coach at St. Mary's College in Moraga, California, a position she'd earned through years of playing and coaching at the highest levels. Born in Connecticut, Diane had been a gifted athlete from an early age. Track, field hockey, and lacrosse came naturally to her, but it was her relentless drive that set her apart. She'd competed on the U.S. Women's Lacrosse World Cup team and was known for her intense focus, sharp coaching style, and the way she inspired young players. Off the field, Diane was vibrant, social, and committed. She lived with her partner, Sharon Smith, in a 6th-floor apartment in San Francisco's Pacific Heights. A beautiful building, but one that came with troubling neighbors. Just down the hall were Marjorie Knoller and Robert Noel, attorneys with an unusual sideline, caring for 2 massive Perro de Presa Canario dogs, Bane and Hera. The dogs weren't just pets. They were part of a breeding program tied to a prison gang leader serving life for murder. The animals were enormous, over 120 pounds each, and muscular to the point of being intimidating, even when calm. Other residents had noticed. The dogs lunged in hallways, snarled in the lobby, and strained against their leashes with alarming force. Some tenants had complained, but nothing changed. The owners brushed off concerns, insisting the animals were misunderstood. Diane, athletic and confident, never expressed open fear. But she avoided the dogs when possible. It wasn't just their size. It was their eyes, their readiness to engage, the way the air seemed to tighten when they were near. On January 26th, Diane returned from grocery shopping, bags in her hands, walking down that familiar 6th-floor hallway toward her apartment. Just a few doors away, the neighbor's door opened. What happened next would unfold in seconds. A sudden explosion of muscle, teeth, and raw power. She had no weapon, no escape route, and nowhere to run. This wasn't going to be a defensive bark or a warning lunge. This was an attack. Bane and Hera were no ordinary pets. They were Perro de Presa Canarios, a rare mastiff breed from the Canary Islands, originally developed to guard livestock and property. Standing over 2 feet at the shoulder and weighing more than 120 pounds each, they were muscular, powerful, and bred for intimidation. In the wrong hands, they were more weapon than companion. Their caretakers, Marjorie Knoller and Robert Noel, were criminal defense attorneys, but the dogs didn't truly belong to them. They were keeping them for Paul Cornfed Schneider, a high-ranking Aryan Brotherhood prison gang member serving life without parole at Pelican Bay State Prison. From behind bars, Schneider ran a dog breeding operation, selling Presa Canarios as aggressive protection dogs to gang affiliates and criminal associates. Through letters and prison visits, Knoller and Noel grew close to Schneider. Some described it as an obsession. They agreed to house several of his dogs in their San Francisco apartment until buyers could be found. But these were not well-socialized animals. Former owners later revealed that Bane and Hera had shown serious aggression before Knoller and Noel ever took them in. Schneider himself bragged in letters that the dogs were bred to intimidate, not to be friendly. Residents in the Pacific Heights building had been voicing concerns for months. The dogs lunged at people in the hallways, snarled through elevator doors, and strained so hard against their leashes that Knoller was often pulled off balance. Some tenants even adjusted their schedules to avoid encountering them. Professional handlers and neighbors warned the couple repeatedly, but Noller and Noel brushed off the concerns as overreactions or prejudice against the breed. Experts would later testify that Presa Canarios are not inherently killers, but without discipline, early socialization, and firm control, their guarding instincts can spiral into unpredictable aggression. Bane and Hera had spent their lives in chaotic, unstable environments that rewarded aggressive behavior instead of curbing it. Despite the mounting red flags, the dogs were allowed to roam the apartment freely, often without muzzles. Management claimed they lacked the legal grounds to intervene, and no authority stepped in to remove the threat. By the time Diane Whipple crossed paths with Bane and Hera on January 26, 2001, every warning had already been raised. The attack that followed wasn't a random tragedy. It was the violent culmination of months, perhaps years, of ignored danger. By late 2000, the warning signs weren't just occasional, they were constant. Neighbors in the Pacific Heights apartment building were actively avoiding the elevator if Noller or Noel were inside with the dogs. Some took to listening at their door before stepping into the hallway. One tenant recalled how Bane had lunged so violently at her that only the leash, wrapped around Noller's wrist, kept the dog from making contact. Another said Hera had snapped at a delivery driver who was just setting down a package. The building's property manager repeatedly told Noller and Noel the dogs were a liability and could be grounds for eviction. They brushed it off, saying the animals were misunderstood and protective. Even outside the building, there were troubling incidents. A local dog walker claimed she saw Bane attack another dog in a nearby park, pinning it to the ground until its owner intervened. In another case, Hera reportedly bit a man's hand as he tried to pet her through a fence. Professional trainers had also weighed in. One behaviorist, asked to assess Bane, warned that the dog was highly reactive and required strict containment, including heavy-duty muzzles during public outings. That advice was ignored. Noller herself wrote to Paul Schneider in prison, describing the dog's brilliance and loyalty, but also mentioning their unpredictable behavior. Schneider's response? Encouragement. He saw their aggression as a feature, not a flaw. Some neighbors even contacted animal control, but without a direct bite incident against a person, enforcement options were limited. The law, in essence, was waiting for a victim before it could act. Diane Whipple was aware of the dogs. She had encountered them in the hallway more than once. Friends later said she confided that she felt unsafe around them, that they looked at her like prey. But with no official action taken, and with the apartment building still her home, she had little choice but to share the space. Every close call, every complaint, every ignored expert opinion had been a prelude. January 25, 2001, began like any other winter day in San Francisco's upscale Pacific Heights. Diane Whipple was preparing for a weekend lacrosse tournament, juggling coaching duties and personal errands. She was fit, focused, and had no idea her final 24 hours had begun. In the apartment across the hall, Marjorie Noller and Robert Noel were tending to Bane and Hera. The dogs had been restless in recent days, louder, more agitated. Some neighbors quietly speculated it was because Noller and Noel had been housing them in a cramped apartment with no yard, relying on brief hallway walks and street trips for exercise. That afternoon, one resident reported seeing Noller in the hallway struggling to control Bane. The big male lunged toward a delivery driver, and Noller had to brace herself, gripping his leash with both hands. She laughed it off, claiming, "He just wants to say hello." It wasn't the first time. Building management had previously received complaints from tenants who felt unsafe passing the dogs. Some even changed their daily routines to avoid contact. But without a physical incident, there was little the landlord could legally do. That evening, Diane returned home from work carrying groceries. A neighbor recalled chatting with her briefly in the lobby. Diane mentioned she was looking forward to a quiet weekend after a busy coaching schedule. She was smiling, relaxed. Meanwhile, upstairs, Noller and Noel settled in for the night. The dogs, fed and watered, paced restlessly in the apartment. Their sheer size and energy were at odds with the confined space. No one could have guessed that less than 24 hours later, those same restless movements would become the frenzied violence that ended Diane's life. But subtle warning signs were there. The lunging, the hallway tension, the neighbors' unease. They just hadn't crossed the line into something actionable. Yet. When investigators later pieced together the events leading to the attack, the day before stood out. Not because anything extraordinary happened, but because everything seemed so normal. It was the calm before a storm no one was truly prepared for. January 26, 2001, late afternoon. The sun was dipping behind the Pacific Heights skyline, casting long shadows into the building's narrow hallways. Diane Whipple was returning from a grocery trip, a bag slung over her shoulder, keys in hand. Inside her apartment across the hall, Marjorie Knoller was preparing to take Bane outside. The 123-pound Presa Canario was full of raw muscle, his nails scraping against the hardwood as he pulled toward the door. Hera, the smaller but equally muscular female, paced behind them. Knoller cracked the apartment door and adjusted her grip on Bane's leash. His massive head was already low, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring. At that exact moment, Diane stepped out of the elevator and began walking toward her unit. The hallway was narrow, barely enough room for two people to pass comfortably, and there was no way to create real distance between her and the approaching dog. Neighbors later recalled hearing a single guttural bark echo through the corridor. Bane lunged forward with such force that Knoller's arm jerked violently. She tried to brace herself, pressing her back against the doorframe, but the dog was already accelerating. Diane froze. She knew these dogs. Everyone in the building did. They were intimidating even on a short leash. But there was no time to retreat. In the seconds that followed, the air shifted from tension to chaos, the sound of claws tearing against carpet, Knoller shouting commands that had no effect, groceries spilling across the hallway as Diane tried to shield herself. Witnesses would later tell police that Bane's first strike was immediate and devastating, a full-body slam that knocked Diane against the wall. The attack had begun, and once it started, there was no pulling the animal back. What happened next would unfold in a matter of minutes, yet leave an impact that would be discussed in courtrooms and newsrooms for years. The hallway, once just a quiet passage between homes, was about to become the scene of one of San Francisco's most horrifying tragedies. The hallway was always quiet on weekday afternoons. The beige carpet muted footsteps, and the pale walls reflected the fluorescent ceiling lights in a way that made everything feel flat and still. Diane Whipple was halfway down that corridor, arms full of groceries, when she heard the faint click of a door opening behind her. It was the door to the apartment of Marjorie Knoller and Robert Noel. The first shape to appear in the doorway wasn't a person. It was Bane. The 123-pound Presa Canario filled the frame like a living wall of muscle. His head was massive, blocky, with eyes that locked onto Diane in a way that sent an instinctive chill down her spine. His body was already tense, tail low, shoulders squared forward. Behind him, Hera, slightly smaller but still powerful, stood alert, her gaze fixed in the same direction. There was no leash, no barrier, no warning. Diane barely had time to shift her grip on the grocery bags before Bane surged forward. The sound was sudden, explosive, claws digging into the hall carpet, his deep, guttural roar tearing apart the stillness. He covered the distance in seconds, and the hit came from the side like a linebacker smashing into a quarterback. Diane's back struck the wall. The bags burst open, apples rolling across the floor, a carton of eggs bursting underfoot. She felt the first bite before she even registered falling. A shocking, crushing pain in her shoulder as teeth punched through her sweatshirt, through skin, through muscle. The force drove her to her knees. She screamed, not only from pain, but from the cold, instant realization that this wasn't going to be a single snap. The dog wasn't letting go. Bane shook his head violently, each movement tearing tissue, forcing hot blood to run down her arm. Diane tried to push him away, both hands gripping the sides of his massive head, but the dog was pure muscle and momentum. Her struggle only seemed to fuel him. Hera, still at the apartment doorway, began barking, sharp, rapid bursts that bounced off the narrow walls, creating an echo that made the hallway feel smaller, more claustrophobic. She darted forward once, delivering a fast, ripping bite to Diane's leg before circling back. From inside the apartment, Knoller's voice cut through the chaos. She was shouting the dog's names, shouting Diane's name, but her tone carried panic, not authority. She stepped into the hall, grabbing at Bane's collar, but the effort was almost symbolic. The dog didn't even acknowledge her. A neighbor down the hall cracked open their door at the sound. The sight froze them. Diane pinned against the wall, one arm twisted upward defensively, her sweatshirt soaked red at the shoulder while the huge dog's head jerked side to side. The neighbor slammed the door and called 911, their voice trembling as they told the dispatcher, There's a woman down. She's bleeding badly. The dogs won't stop. Back in the hall, Diane twisted sideways, trying to crawl toward her apartment, but Bain's grip only shifted. His jaws clamped onto her upper arm, the pressure so intense she felt the bone strain. Each time she tried to rise, he drove her down again, forelegs braced like a predator bringing down prey. The air was thick with sound. Diane's sobbing gasps, Nolar's frantic yelling, Hera's continuous barking, and Bain's deep growls that vibrated through the floor. Somewhere, another neighbor was screaming for someone to bring a weapon. Bain adjusted his bite again, this time lunging for her neck. Diane managed to twist away, but not far enough. Teeth caught the side of her jaw, dragging her down flat on the carpet. Groceries crumpled under her weight, the sweet smell of crushed fruit mixing with the metallic tang of blood. Nolar pulled harder at the collar, bracing herself against the wall, but Bain was unmoved. She would later claim she was bitten in the process, but paramedics would find no serious injuries on her. Another neighbor emerged, wielding a wooden walking stick. He struck Bain across the back with a crack that echoed through the hall. The dog released for the briefest moment, spinning toward the new threat. But instead of retreating, he snapped back to Diane, biting down on her torso this time, shaking her like a rag doll. The 911 line remained open through it all, capturing the chaos. Nolar screaming incoherently, the dog snarling, and Diane's cries growing shorter, more ragged. Minutes felt like hours. Diane's attempts to fight back slowed. Her movements became weaker, less coordinated. Blood pooled beneath her, darkening the beige carpet. The floor was slick now, and each time Bain shifted position, his paws smeared crimson arcs across the hallway. The first 911 call came in at 4:05 p.m. The operator could barely hear the panicked voice over the barking and screaming in the background. "There's a woman being attacked by dogs. She's bleeding. Send help now." By now, Whipple was on the floor, blood pooling beneath her. She wasn't screaming anymore, only short, labored breaths and faint moans. The first police officers burst from the elevator. One officer drew his baton, striking at Bain's head. Another shoved Hera into Nolar's apartment and slammed the door. But Bain was still latched on, his massive head twisting violently. It took both officers, one prying at the dog's jaws with the baton, the other dragging by the collar, to finally wrench him free. Bain fought them even as they forced him into the apartment. The door slammed shut, the sound of his barking muffled, but still shaking the walls. Paramedics knelt beside Diane instantly. Her injuries were catastrophic. Deep lacerations to the neck, severe blood loss, possible airway damage. They started oxygen, applied pressure dressings, and radioed for urgent transport. The stretcher couldn't fit in the narrow hall, so they loaded her onto a backboard and carried her toward the elevator. Blood trailed behind them on the carpet. In less than 10 minutes, Diane Whipple was in the back of an ambulance, racing toward San Francisco General. The fight to save her life was now in the hands of trauma surgeons. The siren's wail echoed down the streets of San Francisco as the ambulance raced toward San Francisco General Hospital. Inside, the paramedics worked in frantic synchronization over Diane Whipple's broken, bloodied body. The gurney beneath her was soaked in crimson. Her pale lips parted in shallow gasps, the oxygen mask fogging faintly with each uneven breath. "BP's tanking again! She's going into shock!" The lead medic shouted over the noise. "Push another fluid bolus, wide open!" Another yelled back, forcing Celine through the IV line as the driver swerved around traffic. Her neck bore a deep, ragged tear dangerously close to the carotid artery, and her shoulder was mangled beyond recognition. Thick dressings were already saturated, leaking bright red down her sides. The paramedics knew they were buying minutes at best. The moment the ambulance screeched to a halt in the trauma bay, the rear doors slammed open, and hospital staff surged forward. The gurney flew down the hall, wheels rattling over tile, the air thick with the metallic tang of blood. Female, mid-30s, multiple severe dog bites, massive blood loss, unstable airway. The paramedic called out in a rapid-fire report. ETA from scene, 15 minutes. Started 2 large-bore IVs, gave 1 unit O-neg en route. She's losing volume fast. The lead trauma surgeon, Dr. William Schechter, stepped in, his eyes narrowing at the sight. "Let's move. Intubate now. Type and cross for 6 units. I want 2 more large-bore IVs, and hang blood bags immediately." Nurses descended on her with practiced urgency. Scissors flashed, shredding the last tatters of her clothing. The wounds were staggering, dozens of lacerations, some deep enough to expose tendon and bone. The worst was a jagged mauling to the side of her neck, a dark, gaping wound that pulsed with every weakening heartbeat. The anesthesiologist slid the breathing tube into place, while a respiratory therapist began squeezing the ventilation bag. The suction roared, clearing blood from her airway. Monitors crackled to life, the jagged peaks of her heart rhythm already faltering. "Pressure's at 60/30, a nurse barked. "Get me more O-neg," Dr. Schechter shouted, clamping down on the neck wound himself, his gloved hands instantly drenched. The room was a blur of motion, a ballet of urgency. One team worked to stem the bleeding, another pumped fluids and blood into her veins, and a third prepped surgical trays in case she could be stabilized enough for the operating room. Every second felt stolen. The sheer brutality of the injuries told its own story. This had not been a quick attack. Her arms bore defensive wounds, shredded muscle and skin where she'd tried to fight the dogs off. Her chest carried deep punctures perilously close to the lungs. And her neck was a ticking clock. A nurse leaned in. "She's cold, 92 degrees. Get warm blankets on her now," Schechter ordered. Hypothermia would only make the bleeding worse. For a brief, fragile moment, the transfusion brought her pressure up. The cardiac monitor steadied, and the team moved to roll her toward the OR. But before they cleared the trauma bay doors, the flatline alarm blared. "Cardiac arrest! Starting compressions!" a resident yelled, climbing onto a stool to throw her weight into chest compressions. Another pushed a syringe of epinephrine into the IV port. The room tightened, all focus narrowing to the flickering hope on the monitor. A rhythm returned, weak, but there. They rushed her down the corridor towards surgery, IV bags swaying, blood dripping from the gurney's edge. Inside the OR, blinding lights illuminated the wreckage of her body. The surgical team worked in unison, clamping severed vessels, irrigating wounds, suctioning pooled blood. Every clamp released revealed another hidden bleed. The anesthesiologist called out vitals. "Pressure's dropping again. She's not tolerating this." "Hang another unit," Schechter demanded. Up in the viewing gallery, an administrator silently made a call to hospital security. "We need SFPD to secure evidence from the patient and prep a chain of custody." The brutality of the wounds made it clear. This was no simple dog bite. This was a crime scene. Outside, the ER waiting room had grown tense. Police officers questioned residents from the apartment building, their voices low and grim. Neighbors described hearing screams, snarls, and thuds echoing in the hallway. Others whispered about the owners, the massive dogs they kept, and the unease they'd caused for months. Back in the OR, the fight was slipping away. Every time the team stabilized one bleed, another began. Her body was running out of blood to give, out of oxygen to circulate, out of time. "Another crash!" the anesthesiologist shouted. The flatline tone filled the air again. Schechter's jaw tightened. "Compressions. Let's go." They shocked her once, twice, pushed more epinephrine, more blood. The surgeon's hands were steady, but their eyes betrayed the reality. They were wrestling a tide that wouldn't turn back. After over an hour of unrelenting effort, Schechter looked at the clock. 5:50 p.m. He removed his gloves, voice low but firm. "Time of death, 1750. The OR went silent. The hum of machines, the faint hiss of oxygen, and the rustle of gowns were all that remained. One by one, the team stepped back, their faces pale, gloved hands streaked with her blood. In the hall, a nurse leaned against the wall, breathing hard. Another sat down, head in hands. The image of Diane's wounds burned into memory. Within minutes, police officers were moving to secure the apartment as a full crime scene. Evidence techs were called in. The death wasn't an accident anymore. It was the start of a criminal investigation. Questions hung heavy in the air. How had the dogs become so lethal? Why had no one intervened sooner? And why had Diane Whipple, in the last minutes of her life, been given no chance to escape? The answers, they would soon discover, were far darker than anyone expected. The moment Diane Whipple was pronounced dead, The hospital paged San Francisco police. Officers were already at the scene, but now the incident had shifted from a severe mauling to a homicide investigation. Detective Tom Walsh arrived at the apartment building just as evidence technicians were photographing the blood-streaked hallway. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the metallic tang of blood still clung to the air. Neighbors stood huddled near the elevator, whispering. A few were crying. One woman kept repeating, I told them those dogs were dangerous." Down in the lobby, uniformed officers were gathering witness statements. The building's security footage, grainy but crucial, was already being pulled. It showed the chaos of the attack's aftermath. A neighbor rushing to call 911, a resident pressing towels to Diane's wounds, and officers securing the two massive Presa Canario dogs in another apartment. By early evening, local reporters had caught wind of the incident. At first, the police press line gave little detail. "We can confirm a woman has died from injuries sustained in a dog attack inside an apartment building in Pacific Heights." But the location alone was enough to light a fire under the city's newsrooms. Pacific Heights, one of San Francisco's most expensive neighborhoods, wasn't the kind of place you expected to hear about deadly animal attacks. Within an hour, news vans were lining the street outside the building, reporters doing live stand-ups in the glow of their camera lights. Inside, investigators were collecting DNA swabs from the dogs, taking measurements of the bite marks, and photographing every angle of the hallway. The blood pattern told part of the story. This was no quick incident. The attack had been prolonged, violent, and frenzied. At 7:00 p.m., the medical examiner's office issued a formal confirmation. The victim was 33-year-old Diane Whipple, a well-known lacrosse coach at St. Mary's College. By the 11 p.m. news cycle, her name, face, and profession were splashed across TV screens across the Bay Area. But beyond the shock of her death, a darker question began to emerge. How had two dogs been allowed to live in this building when so many residents had feared something like this might happen? The case was no longer just about a tragedy, it was about accountability. By the next morning, news of Diane Whipple's death dominated headlines across California. Photos of the vibrant athletic lacrosse coach were placed beside chilling images of the two massive Presa Canarios, Bane and Hera, whose sheer size and power were now infamous. Neighbors voiced what many had feared for months. The dogs were dangerous, their owners dismissive of complaints. The fact that they had been tied to an imprisoned gang leader only added to the public's outrage. Candles, flowers, and handwritten notes began to appear outside Diane's apartment building. Former players and colleagues described her as a dedicated coach and mentor whose energy filled every room she entered. But grief quickly turned to anger. How could two attorneys be allowed to keep animals with such potential for violence in a densely populated building? Why weren't earlier warnings acted upon? Prosecutors soon announced unprecedented charges: second-degree murder against Marjorie Knoller, and involuntary manslaughter against her husband, Robert Noel. The case would become one of the most closely watched trials in San Francisco's history, and a landmark moment in holding dog owners criminally responsible for lethal attacks. For Diane's loved ones, it was only the beginning of a long fight for justice.